and welcome to Tommy's Trains. This is the first episode of Introduction to Model Trains. We're going to cover first O scale, basically Lionel's up until the year 2000. So if you've got something newer than that, keep your eyes peeled because we're going to get to that also. We're also going to look at HO scale. We're going to look at N scale. We're going to start with the old trains first and we'll work our way down through. This is going to be basically a refresher for some of you, and this may be brand new to some of you. I've seen a lot of younger people who got their grandfathers or maybe their father's trains, and then they don't know how to hook them up. They want to play with them. They just got these boxes of stuff and the instructions are long gone. So we're going to cover that for you so we can show you how to take, the old trains and get some life out of them. I'm going to show you some basic maintenance. I'm going to show you how to hook them all up, how to look at some accessories, and then hopefully that'll be a good baseline for you to get started. And as always, I'm always available, so just put down in the comments any questions you might have, and I will always get back to you. Now, if you're fortunate, you might have gotten a train set that came in its original box with the original instructions, so maybe this is just going to help walk you through it. But more than likely, what you got was an old cardboard box that was up in the garage or the attic, just had a bunch of train stuff in it, and you have no idea how to hook that together. So we're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to look at a couple of different things first, and what I want to start with first is just show you some different types of locomotives, and this is only a small sampling. There are many, many more types of locomotives. What we're going to start with is the first Lionels that came out, obviously, was in the 1900s, so they were steam engines. And when somebody talks about steam engines, you're talking about a locomotive that runs on coal or wood or oil, and it heats up a boiler, creates steam, and then that steam goes into these pistons and drives these rods, which makes the wheels turn. Even Lionel had to convert to diesels in the 1950s because that was the latest and greatest. So this is an Alco, but Lionel's most famous train was an F3 diesel. And we're gonna look at some of these trains first, and so like I said, we'll start at the beginning. Now, let's say you got an old steam locomotive. It's a good chance that you probably got something that looks maybe like this. Maybe has a couple of wheels in the front, or it might have 2 wheels. It might have no wheels. It may have just 4. It may have 6. It may have 2 in the back. It may have none. It may have 4. That's all configurations of how the train is set up. And so the way that railroaders talk about trains is that, like, this is a 4-4-2. So 4 small wheels that hold the pilot up front, 4 drive wheels, and then 2 wheels under the firebox. So 4-4-2. You can also see a whole slew of different number configurations. So if you see like a number, a dash, a number, and then a dash, that just tells you the wheel arrangements of the train. For example, this is a 080. There's no wheels in front, 8 drive wheels, none under the back. 060. So you get the picture. So keeping on with the steam locomotives, this is called a tank engine, and you can see that it's got a little bit of coal in the back. There's no tender attached. So these would mostly be used around a switching yard or a small railroad where they didn't have to go very far to resupply the water and coal. So instead of the water and coal being stored here in the tender, these are called the tank engines. So this big part over the top was a water tank, and then just a little bit of coal in the back. And these were really great for yard work because they had good visibility both ways, and they were pretty short, so they could get to the end of the line, switch, and come back. So very handy. And you may not know until you try it, but some of the locomotives have steam whistles, some didn't, some have bells, some don't. And so we'll start with the oldest ones. They just were regular locomotives with a tender, and they may or may not have smoke. They probably had a headlight that may or may not work, but understand that not all the old locomotives were smoke units. Not all the old locomotives had a steam whistle, so you may or may not, and I'll show you how to identify if they do or not. What Lionel did is they released these little buildings and sheds that you could wire up separately, that as time progressed, they put electronics in there, and then they got a little bit more advanced. Even in the 1970s, they tried to do the sound of steam with a steam whistle, and initially it didn't work. Now, the next thing that came along was the sound of steam, and so the sound of steam was basically Lionel's deluxe version, and you can see this little cord here plugs into the back. And so with these connected, there's a little speaker in here, and in here, there's also a little device that is connected to the smoke unit and the drivers. If you see a train with this little wire on the back, don't connect it until you clean the tender. And like I said, look at that New York Central video on how to do that. In the late 1990s, they came out with something a little bit better with some electronics in here, and it was called Rail Sounds and Crew Talk. So it would sound like, steam has, you'd hear the flanges and a lot of cool things. Some of them needed a little 9-volt battery put in there to keep it so that it would sound like a boiler shutdown, but it would still work without it. So I apologize if I'm moving too fast. I apologize if I'm getting too detailed. I don't know exactly what level of detail or how much detail or how quickly to go over this, so feel free to pause it, rewind it, and look at it, or just send me some questions. One of the next things that Lionel had that was very popular was these switch engines. These could run either way, and these were really handy for yard work because of the visibility. They were diesel, had a short wheelbase, super handy. This one is 8-wheel drive, so you see there's gears here and gears here. These little rubber on the wheels are called traction tires, and not all the trains had them. Some had magna traction, which is a whole different animal. I'll talk about that later. You can see I added some weight here at the bottom just because it was so light, but a lot of these only have four-wheel drive. But there are all kinds of diesel locomotives, and this is only two. It's only two. Don't let that bog you down. There's just so many different types of diesel locomotives. This right here is just a little switcher, and this would be used basically the same way that this would, but a lot of times in little areas like on an Air Force base or an Army base, you would see these because they would get coal or oil or something that they'd have to bring onto the base, and they would use these. Similarly, like steel plants would have these. Ford had one. International Harvester had one, just to move cars around. So I hope that wasn't too quick, but that's just an overview of locomotives. And so the last thing I want to talk about with locomotives is if you've got one of these newer locomotives that has like a telephone jack on it that plugs into here, this is a completely different animal, and we'll talk about that in a different episode. So if you've got a train that looks like this with a little telephone jack that hooks in like this, that is not going to work the old-fashioned way. So stay tuned for a video just on Lion, very, very recent. Finally, one of the last things I want to cover is, so here's another steam locomotive. This was from the 70s, and Lionel came out with this pretty early on. They called this the chugging sound of steam. So instead of the mighty sound of steam, the chugging sound of steam. And this one has like a wheel on it with a rubber, and it's got some beans in there. So when it travels, hear that, and it just kind of replicates the sound of a steam locomotive a little bit. So one thing you might hear a lot when you talk about old trains, people talk about E-units. It's basically an electronic unit that makes the train change direction. So some of the trains, they won't go in reverse unless you slide this little lever. Some of them will go in reverse by you shutting the transformer off and giving it power again, polarity, or you may have a direction reverser on the transformer. But when people talk about E-units, they're talking about a mechanical unit that lets you change direction. There are 2 and 3 position E-units. I don't want to bog you down with that, but if you see a locomotive and it has one of these little switches on it, that's your E-unit. So you may have to toggle that to go in reverse. You may find it no matter what you do with the controller, it still maintains the same direction. That's how you know that you've got a locomotive with a manual reverse in it. There were trolleys, there were motorized units, and if someone talks about a motorized unit, they're typically talking about like a little speeder or a little track car like this one that doesn't have the ability to really hook cars on, but it's got a bumper on it a lot of times, so that bumper will change direction. So the guy changes direction to show you which way the car is going to go. So you can either tap that with your hand, or you can run it into a bumper at the end of the track. Now looking at rail cars, a lot of the cars, they didn't have operating couplers. They look like they did, but the only way to connect that car is to physically drop it down on and connect it to get a positive connection. Some of them had a dummy coupler on one end, and then one of these little pull downs on the other end that may be plastic, it may be metal. The metal ones tell you that you can use an uncoupling track, which I'll show you. Plastic ones mean you need to use the pneumatic uncoupler, or you just push down on the little tab here to open that up. Now, if you have this kind of car, you always want to put operating one to the front, and that's how you run it. You may find that these might have plastic wheels on it too, so the cars are insanely light. One thing you might hear a lot of is what they call fast angle wheels. They'll have a taper on it like this. And what that does is, so the car will kind of slide over to the outside of the track, and that will put the smaller diameter on the inside, the larger diameter on the outside. And it's called like differential action, because to go around the outside, you either have to have a bigger wheel, or that wheel has to turn a lot faster than the one on the inside, and it creates drag. So with these fast angle wheels, I could pull a lot more cars. It's a design that came out in the 1970s with MPC. So this is a pretty standard car that you would have gotten in the 1970s with an MPC, Model Products Corporation set. So you can see this one has an operating coupler on here and a dead one here. But unlike the other car that I just showed you, this one doesn't have a little metal tab. It's only got this plastic one. So you had to use this pneumatic uncoupler that came with the set. And how that would work was you would place this like this under the track. And then when you push this down, these little tabs right here come up and grab that little hook underneath and uncouple the car. So if somebody says pneumatic uncoupler, they're talking about one of these gizmos with the plastic tab on it. So as far as Lionel's concerned, there's 3 different types of track. I know there are tons of aftermarket tracks, but most of the time, if you've got a Lionel train set that's pre-2000, it's going to look like this. Now this is 027, and 027 means it's O gauge this way, back and forth, but the 27 means it turns in a 27-inch diameter. It means it's O gauge across, so the old gauge trains will technically run on this. They may not go on the tight corners, but the 27 was just how they made it so that the curves were sharp enough to make a 27-inch diameter, so they could really cram a lot of track into a small place. This is called fast track. It's much newer, so if your track looks like this, we'll get to it, but that's not going to be what we're covering first. Standard O basically looks the same, but the profile is way different. You can make these fit, but you kind of have to ream it out a little bit. So standard O would have much wider curves, but also the track profile much higher, and also the straight sections on standard O much longer. There were all kinds of different tracks you could buy, and this is an example of a turnout, or most of the people just call it a switch. So you could have this go in a right-hand turnout or a left-hand turnout, and the way to tell what it is you just look at it, and if it's going to make the train go right on the switch, it's a right hand. If it makes the train go left, it's a left. And you'll see that this one doesn't have any pins in it, and that's because these require some special fiber pins, and we'll talk about these a little bit later in a different episode because that's a little bit more involved than what we want to get into today. But you could get the track in all kinds of different sizes. Here's a half track, the half curves. So these came with the pins on one side. So you basically just lay the track around. But if you wanted to, like, say, make your train, instead of going this way, you want it to go this way, all you have to do is take a pair of pliers, pull the pins out, switch it in, and put the pins on the other side, and it's that simple. These are called remote control tracks or uncoupling tracks, and how this works is you connect these two wires from the switch over to your lock-on, and by holding the switch down, you basically create an electromagnet here. It would pull down this little metal tab right here. When that happens, the coupler opens, and because it's an electromagnet, you don't want to hold it down more than a second or two because you'll burn it out. So you may see a remote controlled uncoupling track or remote controlled track or an uncoupling track. It may look like this one. This one has some extra lines in it, and we'll talk about those later. There's also different kinds of lock-ons that we'll talk about later. Just to keep this as simple as possible today, we're not going to get into those extra things. You may have some little green wire like this. You may have some one pair wire like this with two wires. These right here are lighted bumpers, so this would sit on the track and it would get power off the track and illuminate this little light. This one die cast. There were plastic ones as well. Here's one of those switches, and these were used for a lot of different things, not just the uncoupling track, but to operate a lot of accessories, and we'll talk about those too. So this is called a lock-on, and the way these work is you would take the wires from your controller, and there's a 1 and a 2. Here's a typical controller from the 1970s transformer, and what this does is it takes 110 volts AC out of the outlet, and it's still AC going to the train, but it ramps it down to a much more safer level. Don't ever just take these wires to the track and plug it into an outlet, like cut the plug off and hook it in here. You'll hurt yourself. So don't do that. Usually the hot one would have a plastic over it, and the return or the ground would just have a thumb screw on it. So you just strip back like a half an inch, wrap it around there, and when you look at it, like you would just take your lock on and you just snap it in like this, and then up under like that, and then you take the wires. The left one goes to the left one, the right one goes to the right one. These are just little spring clips, so you just hold this down and then tuck the wire under, and same on this side. Here's an example of an operating dump car, and there were mostly two different versions. There was the log dump and an ore dump or a coal dump or a gravel dump. Basically just a car with something like this on it that would dump. Most of the time you're going to see one of those uncoupling tracks like this with this little button, and that's going to operate the dump. But you may see tracks like this one where it also does unloading, and that's for different accessories that, like I said, we'll go over later. But you can do both functions with this track, and so you might look at this and say, oh, unload, that's the one I want. No, you actually don't. You want uncouple, because you want to use this center tab right here. Unload uses these. So that's how that works. And these only work with track power applied, so you have to put your train in neutral in order to do it. Now, some people might call these controllers, they might call them transformers, they might call them power packs. They're all basically referencing the same thing. And these came in a lot of different shapes and sizes. You may see one like the one I just showed you. You may see one of these newer ones that has a separate transformer. You may see one of these aftermarket ones like this. It's possible you have a newer one that looks like this. And there were also, a bunch more that Lionel had. If you have a transformer and you look at it and it says like AB or ABU, the U is always ground, and the A is usually the higher power, the B is usually the lower power. All the U's are connected together universally. So I usually hook it to A to 1, and then U to 2. So your train, this one's pretty easy. It's only 6 wheels, so you just set it on the track. If you've got a bunch of wheels, you really want to make sure all the wheels are on the track, because you've got a hot and then you've got a ground on both sides. And if you've got a short across any of that, it'll spark. You probably have a circuit breaker in your controller. It'll trip. You might hear a little, like a spring twing, and then when you fix it, it'll reset. If you keep hearing it twing or you see a red light come on, you really need to take a look. Maybe you've got something across your tracks. Maybe you've got a car off the tracks. A lot of the trains in the 70s, they came with plastic wheels to kind of make it safer, but I don't like them. they just made the cars too light. But if you turn power on, make sure that your wires are all connected, make sure your cars are all on, and make sure nothing's across the tracks. So if your train has a smoke unit on it, you don't want to run it without smoke. You also don't want to add too much smoke in it. So usually about 4 or 5 drops. And don't fret if it doesn't start smoking immediately. It's one of those things that it heats up, so it has to run for a couple minutes for it to work. And so we've gone into neutral here. So I've got 2 choices. I can either just turn the power down, turn it back on, or I can hit the direction change button. If you have a set speed and you just hit the direction change, it'll go to neutral, then go the other way, neutral, back the other way again. And then, so the steam whistle on this one sounds a little different. If you've got a locomotive that you know has a steam whistle, and when you put power on and the steam whistle doesn't work, first check your wires. If you've got these crossed, it won't work. I'm not sure why, but it won't work. So if your steam whistle doesn't work, or your horn doesn't blast, first check your wires. Make sure that 1 goes to A, 2 goes to U, or if you've just got one of these controllers that doesn't have anything, make 1 for 1 straight out. So you may say it's AC, why does it matter? Well, it doesn't typically. For just regular operation. It's not going to affect the train. If you have these connected, it'll still go. It just matters when you've got accessories or you're trying to get the whistle to go, because it works differently. Speaking of AC and DC, most Lionel trains are AC, meaning alternating current, means that the current changes back and forth, and that's how you change direction with these trains, is you change the direction of the current. With DC, it's direct current, so you probably have a much smaller controller, and also you cannot take an AC locomotive and run it on DC, or DC especially on AC, but some of them will say on the box runs on AC or DC, and those are probably the safest ones to have. So just always handle your trains carefully, because especially steam engines, they always have tons of little pieces on them that can break, like this little whistle, the bell, the pipings, the side rods. We'll get into a little bit of basic maintenance later, but always carry your steam locomotives very securely. It makes an awful mess if you drop one. Some of these trains have a special switch on them, where this one here says reverse on it, on or off, and you get a smoke on and off. Some of them may be labeled, some of them may not be labeled, so you may have to play with it. But what happens is if you have this the wrong way, no matter what you do with the controller, it only goes one way. So if your train, no matter what you do, only goes one way, check for little switches and flip it the other way. So in the next episode, we'll talk a little bit more about switches and wiring. If you have questions, put them down bottom, and hopefully this has been helpful to you. And I appreciate you watching another episode of Tommy's Trains. I'll talk to you next time. Thanks.